Something to keep in mind as you are determining the validity of the arguments in this section is you're not trying to decide if a premise is true or not. We are assuming that the premises are true and then deciding if the conclusion then follows from those premises. So don't say that an argument is invalid because a premise doesn't make sense. That's not what you're trying to decide in the homework. You're trying to decide, if I assume that the premise is true, that each premise is true, can I then make the conclusion? If you can, then it's valid. So that's what you're interested in. So for example, with this argument, we have, if the road is wet today, then it rained today. Then the premise, the road is wet, so we'll conclude it must have rained today. So if we translate this into logic symbols, the road is wet, we'll let that be W, and we'll represent it rained today by R. So what this is saying is, if the road is wet, today, then it rained today. The road is wet, so that's W. So we conclude it must have rained today. So this is our argument. The argument is, assuming this is true. So assuming this is true and assuming this is true, does this conclusion follow from those premises? And is that valid or not? Is it valid that the conclusion follows? Well, this argument is an example. If this P implies Q, P therefore Q, that's an example of modus ponens. So it's actually a form of valid argument because it's the form of modus ponens. Modus ponens is a common form of valid argument. So as a logical argument, if we assume the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. However, this, if you think about it, this first premise really isn't true, right? You know that the road, it doesn't have to rain for a road to be wet. It could be wet for other reasons than rain. But that's not what we're deciding here. We're not deciding whether or not the premise makes sense. We're assuming that it does, and then we're trying to decide, does the conclusion make sense given those premises? So given that if the road being wet means that it rained, and given that the road is wet, can we then conclude that it rained? That's what we're trying to decide. Assume the premises are true, decide if the conclusion makes sense with those premises. Okay? Keep that in mind as you're doing the homework.